All right, back to domestic politics. I'm joined now by Liberal MP Tim Wilson, live from our Melbourne studio. Thanks very much for your company.
Thanks, Peter. Good to chat to you.
Is scrapping the Green Army a good idea or a bad idea?
Well, the Green Army is a program that you can have when you can afford it. And that classically underpins why having a strong economy is so important. If you want to protect the environment, provide health and education services to the population, you need to have an underpinning strong economy, and you also need to have the government revenues from taxpayers to support it.
But you didn't have that when it was brought in. You didn't have any of that when it was brought in.
Well, as you know, Peter, I wasn't in the parliament, but what we know full well now is that unless we reduce spending and make sure that we clamp down on spending, we're not going to be able to continue to afford these measures, which is why we have to consistently push forward with sensible budget management and hope that the opposition, Labor, comes to the party, because it's the only way we're going to be able to afford the social dividend.
But you said you have to consistently push forward with policies that try to help the budget. How was this then introduced by the government that you're now part of when the budget deficit was even higher than it is now?
Well, you know, Peter, I wasn't there at having those
conversations.
Sure,
but it's the government you're part of.
But the fundamental point remains the same. I mean, the government at the time looked at what it could afford. It had to obviously honour its election commitments, as we've consistently done. We're not going to be Jolly Gillard Mark II. There is no Green Army under a government I lead. There is actually, we honour those commitments. We've implemented them. Now we face the challenge of what we can afford.
But your government, your now government, knew in opposition what the circumstance of the budget was, and even notwithstanding what the PFO was like versus the MyEFO that you guys brought down once in power. I acknowledge you weren't in Parliament yet, but it was all red as far as the eye could see, and yet you still took an election that was inconsistent to your principles when it comes to affordability at this time. You took a policy to that election, and now it's been scrapped.
Well, the basis of your question is false, Peter. It's not inconsistent with the position of the Liberal Party to do things when we can afford it, to care and support for the environment. That was the decision that was taken at the time. We've re-evaluated the situation in light of the other programs for the environment and the constraints in the budget environment, and we've had to make tough calls. And this, again, underpins why a strong economy is so important to deliver the social and the environmental dividend, and that's where the focus of the government is and will continue to be.
Well, Tony Abbott has taken to Facebook and said it's a bad principle to axe your own policy for the Greens policy because it means that their priorities are more important than ours. That would hardly be a smart move for a centre-right government. Your reaction?
Well, we took a position to the election. We get to decide the agenda. The Parliament gets to decide the outcome. And, of course, there could be a look at the scale back of the Green Army policy to accommodate what had to be done to get the backpackers tax legislation through. But in practice, if it's a choice between being economically irresponsible and continuing to fund things in perpetuity that we can't afford, or being a responsible government that secures this country's promise for next generations, I'm in the camp of making responsible decisions.
You mentioned the backpacker tax. That was one of the final pieces of legislation for the parliamentary year. Help me understand why the government decided it was better to have a higher tax rate than what Labor was proposing and spend $100 million to buy the votes of the Greens in the Senate.
Well, it was about making the system consistent with seasonal workers and recognising that we want to be able to continue to attract people to pick fruit and those sorts of things.
With a higher tax.
Jobs in rural and regional areas.
Wouldn't you be more likely... Well, hang on, sorry. Wouldn't you be more likely to attract people with a lower tax?
Well, no, but we also have to require them to pay tax, and even other types of workers who work in like circumstances, such as seasonal workers, or, I might add, Australians, have to pay some tax because they have to make a contribution to supporting these social services and investment in our country. That's not an unreasonable thing. What we want to do is attract people. We want them to do the work, but they have to accept some responsibility, just like they pay GST on their expenditure.
Sure. But you talk about attracting people. Aren't people more likely to be attracted to New Zealand for its lower rate than to Australia for our higher tax rate? And aren't they more likely to be attracted to Australia at the 13% rate that Labor wanted rather than the 15% rate that you guys went along with?
But we also had to be responsible with the budget, Peter, and that was the key point about 15% consistency across the board, rather than just having whatever lower rate the ALP might have been making an ambit claim for. But the reality is, if you think the only reason people come and visit Australia want to go and see the Great Barrier Reef or go and see Indigenous culture or the great and wonderful artistic works in the great state of Victoria or even the Opera House and the Harbour Bridge is based on the tax rate, fundamentally misunderstands why people come and then why they work to be able to support them. I don't think any backpacker would begrudge that they have to make a contribution to our country. They still use our roads, they still use our public transport and like services. The question is how much they have to pay, and I think we've come up with a sensible outcome.
I think we all know that most backpackers are probably working cash in hand rather than paying tax anyway, but how many years is it going to take, Mr Wilson, for you guys to recoup the 100 million or 160 million, if you add it all up, that it cost you to do the deal with the Greens through your 15% rate rather than Labor's 13%?
Well, but this is why we had offsets, and there was a change around the superannuation arrangements for the backpackers to deal with this situation. But the budget is more complex than one specific tax dealing with one specific challenge, and that's why, looking holistically, we're going to face continued challenges if we don't take a prudent and continue to take a prudent financial management approach, which is the key difference between us, frankly, and the opposition, who seem to want to give foreign workers lower tax rates than working Australians, while also opposing every single measure to reduce spending that the government has put forward.
But there's little argument, and I wonder how you feel about this, because I know what your raison d'etre has been through a lifetime of arguing for free market principles prior to entering Parliament, so I wonder how you feel about this less than 6 months into your new job. But on this issue of the backpacker tax, the coalition, as opposed to Labor, is the party of higher spending and higher taxes.
Well, I think that's fundamentally misunderstands the situation, Peter. I mean, I'd love to have lower tax rates across the board. Nobody is disputing that, and I don't think anybody would doubt my commitment to that. But when you have foreign workers who come, predominantly spend all of their money in Australia, but also have an obligation to contribute to the cost of running this country, which they're enjoying while they're out here, to have a 15% tax rate without any tax-free threshold seems like a pretty fair compromise to me. I mean, I think you'd like a 15% tax rate. I think I'd like a 15% tax rate. And so I think Labor's, amber claim out there was just the politics that it always was. And I can imagine if they were in government, they wouldn't be pushing for that. And there was no basis of the 13% rate except for the fact that they wanted to wedge the government. Let's get real.
If I was a backpacker, I'd actually rather the tax rate that I'm currently on through the normal tax system than a flat 15% tax rate.
Well, because you've got to get the tax-free threshold.
Exactly. Because
and they wouldn't be paying tax.
Exactly. That's what I would prefer. I would prefer just to be treated like any other Australian if I was a backpacker, because I work on the assumption that I wasn't earning enough to get above the threshold because I'm a backpacker.
But it's also a fundamental misunderstanding about how backpackers work, where often they work for multiple employers, they work for short periods of time, they move on to other sites, and it's just not a practical way. It's not like somebody who's employed full-time like yourself, Peter, in one site or one job or multiple jobs, and you're a resident of the country. So that's why it operates that way. It's a sensible way, and the 15% rate without a threshold is an entirely sensible way to resolve the problem.
OK, so if 15% is a sensible way to resolve the problem, two quick questions that are interrelated. Firstly, what was the government doing for 3 years not adjusting it from a zero rate? And secondly, when it did, why didn't it go for the sensible 15% rate? Why did it try to go for 32.5%?
Well, firstly, Peter, that this is these are questions predominantly for the Treasurer. As much as I'd like to have been involved in the writing of last year's budget, I was human rights
Would you have done it very differently? I guess that's the real question. I suspect you might have.
No. Well, I don't know what was going through the thinking then, but what I do know is that the government is looking firstly at how to measure expenditure and also find new revenue sources for the government. And it's not realistic, it's not fair to have Australians paying tax rates in the vicinity of 30 to 50% or thereabouts, and having people coming here and not making some contribution for the infrastructure, for the services they may be using. And that's where the government has come from an approach, and it seems like it's a sensible conclusion to me.
All right, we're almost out of time, but one final one on the AAA credit rating. Do we have both a revenue and a spending problem that have to be addressed for us to ensure that we keep the AAA credit rating?
Well, I've always said that we have a spending problem, and we do, but I do think, and I've always argued this, that there is a challenge around the operations of our tax system. I talked about this in my first speech, that we need a more efficient tax system that removes any incentive for people to work around taxes and how they're applied, to move assets from one place to another and income from one place to another. And I think if we looked at both of those things and actually simplified the tax system, we would do an enormous amount around revenue, but not through higher taxes, but actually by making the system more efficient, as well as dealing with spending.
I'd love to know whether you think that more could get done in this country if we had a unicameral parliament like New Zealand, notwithstanding their electoral system. But we're out of time. We're out of time.
Well, it's not feasible, Peter, because
States.
in the end, we have states, but we're also a much larger country. And the reality is Queensland, Victoria, WA are all different places with different cultures. The state of Victoria has basically the same population as all of New Zealand.
Maybe we should hand states more powers and let the Commonwealth just deal with defence. That's another discussion for another day. Tim Wilson, I know you're probably on board with some of that. All right, thanks very much for your company. Always appreciate it.
Thanks, Peter.
Cheers. All right, we're going to take a quick break here on the program. When we come back, sport with